morning, Advocate Hoover and everybody.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Commissioner, we are ready to proceed, and there's some good news. There's some new faces this morning, and they're ready to proceed with the witness.
Your full names, please.
Zakheni Zamani Dlamini is my full name, Commissioner.
Do you have any objections to taking the prescribed oath?
No, I don't.
Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Say so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you, sir. You may be seated.
Thank you.
Advocate Liver, there's some interest as to who the people, what are their names, the new faces that you talked about.
Mr. Commissioner, it's my well-known colleague by now.
We know him.
Advocate Hoover.
She looks different.
Yes, but pretty, if I may say.
Yani.
And then we have our forensic team leader, Mr. Reda, and also part of the forensic team, Ms. Scorano. She is a new member to the team. She has joined us about a month ago.
Thank you. All right, who's going to lead the witness?
Ms. Hoyer will be leading the witness, Commissioner. Commissioner, Mr. Dlamini will be testifying on the SA Home Loans transaction. And a quick recap on this transaction, Mr. Roy Raja and Mr. Benedict Mohangalo from PIC have come before the Commission to testify about the 45 million transaction fee or arranging fee. Mr. Ian Sinton from Standard Bank has also come before the Commission, and Mr. Kevin Penwarden has also came to give the version of SA Home Loans. Now, there are certain issues that arose in Mr. Kevin Penwarden's testimony. There were third men, if I could put it like that, information, and Mr. Dlamini was actually the person who the issues were raised in front of. So Mr. Dlamini will take us through his statement. He has prepared a statement for this commission, and I will take him through it.
Thank you. Of course, you have a signed statement, right?
That is correct, Commissioner. I have submitted a signed statement.
Mr. Dlamini, can you begin at paragraph 1 of your statement?
I am an adult male, qualified as a chartered accountant and employed by SA Home Loans Pty Limited, which I shall refer to as SAHL, in the position of Director Business Development. I make the statement because my colleague and Chief Executive Officer of SAHL, Mr. Kevin Penwarden, has appeared before this Commission of Inquiry of the Public Investment Corporation. Some of the matters that Mr. Penwarden spoke to, specifically my interactions with Mr. Kolofelo Maponya and Mr. Wellington Masagesa during September of 2018, both of whom are non-executive directors of SAHL, are matters of which I have personal knowledge. Mr. Penwarden appeared on 29 May 2019, and he gave detail of the shareholding structure of SAHL and details surrounding the claim of Matome Maponya Investments, MMI, for the payment of fees by SAHL. I have intentionally elected not to repeat the evidence that the PIC Commission has already heard from Mr. Penwarden. Accordingly, in making the statement, I shall outline my role and functions within SAHL, and I shall detail the relevant events of 2018 that took place during July, September, and November of that year. My role and functions within SAHL. Whilst my title is Director of Business Development, I am not a director of SAHL duly appointed. The term director in my title is used more descriptively to refer to my role as the person within the company that manages the business development portfolio. I form part of the executive management team of SAHL. My functions include: 1, managing the development of SAHL's presence in the affordable housing market and the home loans market for government employees by developing products for those markets, securing funding lines for those markets, and developing distribution strategies to reach those markets. 2, managing the relationship with the Government Employees Housing Scheme, GHS, and overseeing the management of a call center service that SAHL provides to the GHS. This is a call center that assists government employees to enroll into the GHS and also provides an education service to assist employees to improve their ability to access housing finance. 3, managing programs and initiatives that are necessary to transform SAHL so that it becomes and remains diverse and inclusive. These programs and initiatives are inward-facing, focusing on the demographics of the workforce, skills development, corporate culture, and outward-facing, focusing on inclusive procurement, enterprise development, and ensuring that the products that SAHL markets are inclusive. And 4, managing the activities of the South African Housing Development Fund, this being the fund that provides debt finance to affordable housing developers using a 1.5 billion rand funding line provided by the Government Employees Pension Fund, GPF.
Sorry, could I just ask you, if you don't mind, that 1.5 billion is directly from the GEPF, not via the PIC?
Commissioner, it is via the PIC.
Via the PIC?
Yes, that is correct.
Question, morning, Mr. Dlamini. Yes, a question here. The GEHS, is that a government department or a government agency, or is something you run within your company?
The Commissioner, the Government Employees Housing Scheme is an arm of the Department of Public Service and Administration. It sits within government. It currently is constituted as a project office within the department, so it does not exist as a separate entity. These services that we provide were related to the funding line that we accessed from the PIC. So part of the commitments, they included us assisting with the work of the GHS, given that the target market was the same people that the GHS is trying to empower with housing.
And you charge a fee for those services, I guess.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Yeah,
There's a fee for and a service level agreement for those services specifically.
Okay.
Can I just ask you not to drop your voice as you go along? Because it should be recorded.
Okay. Apologies, Commissioner. Will do. I have been with SAHL for 12 years. I commenced my employment at SAHL in 2007 in the position of risk manager, where my function was to monitor areas of all types of risk within the company and to raise the flag where I identified an area of risk so that the necessary systems may be put in place to reduce, if not eliminate, such risk. My role as risk manager grew over time. It also included managing teams responsible for compliance, ethics, fraud investigations, and internal audit. I also became involved in developing plans for SAHL to enter the affordable housing market. As a consequence, during 2013, I was promoted into the executive team and held the position of Director, Affordable Housing and Risk. During 2015, I was promoted to my current role that I have described above. For the sake of completeness, I mentioned that prior to joining SAHL, I served my articles of clerkship at Deloitte & Touche, And after I qualified as a chartered accountant, I joined SAHL.
And you are based where, in Durban or Joburg?
Commissioner, we are based in Durban.
In Durban, okay.
That is correct. The relevant events of 2018. I'm aware of 3 events that occurred during 2018 at which the non-payment of the amount of 45 million rand for a transaction origination fee was revived. These 3 events are: 1, the meeting that I was to attend in July of 2018 with Mr. Penwarden, Mr. Rob Kelso, a colleague and Chief Operating Officer of SAHL, and Dr. Dan Majila, the PIC's Chief Executive Officer at the time. 2, discussions that commenced with a face-to-face meeting that took place on 5 September 2018 between Mr. Maponya, Mr. Masekesa, and I, and continued through telephonic discussions during September of 2018. And 3, the board meeting, SAHL board meeting of 7 November 2018. I deal with each of these in turn. July 2018. During December 2017, I had informed the PIC that of the 9 billion rand facility it had lent and advanced to SAHL for the home loan business, the amount of 5 billion rand that was allocated for funding home loans for government employees was going to be exhausted by June 2018, and the amount of 2 billion rand that was allocated for funding home loans in the affordable housing market was going to be exhausted in April 2018. The further amount of 2 billion that was allocated for traditional home loan lending still had sufficient unutilized capacity at that stage.
Mr. Dlamini, if I could just ask you, and I might be incorrect in it, you talking of 9 billion, was the original request for 9 billion or was the original request of this amount for 10 billion? I seem to have 10 billion in my mind, but it might have been the subsequent one.
Commissioner, the 10 billion is subsequent to the 9 billion I'm mentioning here. The 9 billion that this 5, 2, and 2 is made up of is the amount that was negotiated and advanced soon after the PIC became, or GEPF became a shareholder in SAHL. So
That was originally for 9 billion, not for 10 billion. There
Yes.
wasn't an original request
it
for
was
10
not
billion.
for, yes, it was,
Okay.
it was,
For 9 billion.
we were granted what we had requested. Okay, that is
Thank you.
correct.
Just another question there. Just give me, to get a sense of the scale, what would 5 billion, how many loans would 5 billion be, just roughly? Like how many loans are you talking about? It looks like it's a large number. And roughly, I mean, it doesn't have to be exact number.
Commissioner, just an opportunity to check if I don't have the exact number, and then I will give an estimation. Apologies.
Can I request that we get back to it at the end?
I think, yeah, we can do that.
Call it in a 5 billion rand facility. Commissioner, let me rather give you the number. Let me not rush through it. I will give you, I can make it as a submission, just the exact numbers. In those circumstances, SAHL applied to the PIC for a further facility of 10 billion rand for the government employee home loans. There was a further 2 billion rand to the application that SAHL submitted for further funding, which was for the affordable housing market, but it is not relevant to the present discussion. I submitted this application to Mr. Benedict Mongalo, who holds the position of Fund Principal Development Investments within the PIC, with whom I remained in contact to receive updates on the funding application.
Can I stop you there? can you just give a rough estimation of when this application was submitted?
Commissioner, the application was submitted in December 2017. It was roughly the second week of December of that year. I just don't have the exact date in front of me. It was sent in by email.
Thank you. You can continue.
By June 2018, there had been no progress, and it became urgent to hold a meeting with Dr. Majila to discuss the further facility that SAHL had applied for. The meeting with Dr. Majila was scheduled for 10 July 2018. Mr. Penwarden, Mr. Kelso, and I traveled to Pretoria to attend this meeting with Dr. Majila. The meeting could not be held on that day as Dr. Majila advised that he was required to attend a meeting at National Treasury, and he asked that the meeting be rolled over to the next day. Mr. Kelso and I were unable to remain in Pretoria to attend the meeting on the next day, but Mr. Penwarden remained behind, and I am advised that such meeting did indeed proceed on 11 July 2018 between Mr. Penwarden, Dr. Majila, and Mr. Masekesa.
Sorry, if you don't know, it's not a problem, but in that meeting, obviously you weren't there, but were there minutes? Was there somebody taking or making a record of the meeting? Did you or Mr. Penwarden have anybody who was taking a note of that meeting?
Commissioner, to my knowledge, there were no notes taken. Certainly not that I did see. I received feedback from Mr. Penwarden verbally after that meeting. In the run-up to the meeting with Dr. Majila, Mr. Penwarden had advised me of the further approach that Mr. Maponya made to Mr. Penwarden in relation to the 45 million rand that MMI claimed was due to it. Mr. Penwarden relayed to me that he informed Dr. Majila that the issue of the 45 million rand had resurfaced again from MMI, and that Dr. Majila had made it clear to Mr. Penwarden that the issue was closed. No transaction origination fee was due to MMI for the funding that PIC made available to SAHL for the home loan business. It was also relayed to me by Mr. Penwarden that the reason Dr. Majila gave for the delayed response from the PIC on SAHL's further application for 10 billion rand was that there was a perception that the Standard Bank Group Limited was not providing as much funding to SAHL as the PIC was. As a separate work stream, Mr. Penwarden returned to Durban after this meeting and worked on a submission to Dr. Majila. That was sent to Dr. Majila electronically, which submission showed that as a matter of fact, Standard Bank had provided more funding to SAHL than the PIC. September 2018. By September, the PIC had still not responded to SAHL's application for a further facility of 10 billion rand. SAHL had scheduled a strategy workshop to be held on 5 September 2018 in Johannesburg, where high on the agenda was the funding pressure that SAHL faced as a result of the non-response from the PIC on the application for further funding. All members of the SAHL board were required at this meeting, as was the executive committee of SAHL. In particular, Mr. Penwarden, Mr. Kelso, Mr. Masekesa, Mr. Maponya, and I were present at the strategy workshop. The strategy workshop on 5 September 2018 was to be followed the next day by a further strategy workshop on the development fund, and Mr. Penwarden, Mr. Kelso, and I were remaining in Sandton in order to attend the development fund strategy workshop the next day. Mr. Maponya was to play no role in the strategy workshop of 6 September, but Mr. Masekesa was going to be present. At the strategy workshop of 5 September 2018, Mr. Maponya did not raise the issue of the 45 million rand at all. The workshops I referred to above were both held at the Radisson Blue Gautrain Hotel, and Mr. Penwarden, Mr. Kelso, and I were also staying at the same hotel. After the workshop had been completed and I was back in my room, sometime between 3:30 and 4 p.m. that afternoon, Mr. Maponya called me on my mobile phone and asked that I meet him later that afternoon. I informed Mr. Maponya that I had dinner plans with Mr. Kelso and Mr. Penwarden for 6 p.m. that evening and that I could only meet for a drink. Mr. Maponya did not inform me why he wanted to meet me, but considering that we had spent the whole day together in the strategy workshop, it was not unusual to meet for a drink afterwards. I proceeded to Nelson Mandela Square, specifically the butcher shop and grill, where Mr. Maponya had said we should meet. When I arrived, Mr. Maponya was there together with Mr. Masekesa. After a few introductory remarks, Mr. Maponya led the discussion and said that he wants to talk about the 45 million rand that he believes is still owing to MMI. He said that the non-payment to him of the 45 million rand is the main reason why SAHL had not yet been able to secure approval of the 10 billion rand funding line. He said that we as SAHL need to find a way of regularizing the payment of 45 million rand and to include it into the new facility SAHL was applying for, so that from that facility MMI would get paid the initial amount of 45 million rand it had laid claim to, together with a new transaction origination fee of 0.5% on the facility of 10 billion rand, being 50 million rand. So that in total, the amount of 95 million rand was to be paid to MMI. He said that Dr. Majila had indicated that if SAHL could find a way of regularizing these payments to MMI, he, Dr. Majila, would support such payments. Mr. Maponya indicated that the application for the new facility of 10 billion rand would not be successful if the issue of fees was not resolved. Mr. Maponya also indicated that Standard Bank would support the payment of these fees if their payment has been regularized.
Sorry, if I could just ask a couple of questions there. You submitted the application in December 2017. This is now September 2018, really about a year later. And we are now in the end of June 2019. Has there been any progress regarding this new facility or any response from the PIC to date?
Commissioner, there has not been progress or a formal response to date.
And have you followed up with Mr. Mongalo?
That is correct, Commissioner. I do regularly follow up.
And what is his comment, if any?
Commissioner, there has been a history to the reasons that have been offered. If you allow me, I'll just maybe, so the first quarter of 2018 into the second quarter of 2018, the main reason that was offered was that there were governance processes within the PIC that were unfolding. I think certain changes to some of their governance or risk parameters, and that was the cause for the delay. There were also...
Just to ask, that means that they said it was a risk to delay, they didn't reject it?
They did not reject it, that is correct, Commissioner. There were also, in that same period, reports certainly fed into, which I received from the PIC, that suggested they were concerned from certain groupings of labor representatives that were concerned with how SAHL was performing, that then by the July meeting, the main reason was then offered to be the unequal contribution of the shareholders to the funding of SA home loans. I think since I would say since the last quarter of 2018, there were discussions that were happening between the GHS, the GEPF, and the PIC. There's a body within the DPSA called the GHS Advisory Council, which consists of representatives of labor and representatives of the Department of Public Service and Administration. Our understanding was there were deliberations in that forum which led to support for this initiative to continue. Those deliberations were only really concluded end of the first quarter of 2019, more or less. The specific dates I don't have, Commissioner. Since that time, we have been informed that there are discussions that are ongoing between GEPF, PIC, and GEHS, really centered around that the funding that is provided needs to be such that the pricing that is offered to employees or government employees is very attractive. We have not been formally approached by any of those stakeholders with the outcomes of that process to date. So as things stand, the application remains open and in process.
So one can conclude and that the delay really has nothing to do with whether or not the 95 million hasn't been paid.
I would conclude in that manner, Commissioner, that it is not down to the 95 million. At least that is my view.
Based on what you've just told us.
That is correct.
And secondly, it's Mr. Maponya in the second part of that paragraph indicates that Standard Bank would support the payment of these fees. Was that accurate, or was that him? I mean, would he have any authority to speak on behalf of Standard Bank in that capacity?
Commissioner, I do not believe he had that authority. I certainly did not take it as suggesting that he has received this confirmation from Standard Bank that they will support these payments. I merely saw it as a way of him showing that all the stakeholders would be supportive. Therefore, it is in my interests to assist. But I certainly did not believe that if he's speaking for what Dr. Majila has said or what Standard Bank has said, it actually comes from that person. Can I continue, Commissioner? So whilst Mr. Masekesa was not leading the discussion, he confirmed and agreed with what Mr. Maponya was saying to me as I have outlined it above.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but you just indicated in relation to the earlier paragraph that you did not think that when Mr. Maponya was speaking that and mentioning names, whether Standard Bank or Dr. Machila, that he actually had the authority of Dr. Machila to speak on his behalf. But Mr. Masekesa is the Chief of Staff, in essence, in Dr. Machila's office. He's also a board member at the request of the PIC on SA home loans. Did that alter your view of the relationship or attitude of Dr. Machila, or did you think that this was the two of them together without Dr. Machila's involvement? What was your impression there, or your thinking, or did you ask that?
Commissioner, I did not ask. I certainly did not take it that even Mr. Masekesa was representing Dr. Machila. I must admit that I did not clarify which hats, if I can put it in that way loosely, that the two directors I was speaking to were wearing in the discussion. They are directors of SAHL, but they also happen to have roles within the shareholder grouping. So as the Commissioner has indicated, Mr. Masekesa is an employee of the PIC in Dr. Majila's office at the time. And Mr. Maponya is the chairman of MMI, which is the main shareholder of BHC, the shareholder in SA Home Loans. I did not clarify whether they were talking to me in their capacity as directors or in their capacities as the representatives of those companies. I certainly did not behave as if this is now information I'm hearing. If Mr. Masekesa is saying something, that it's coming directly from Dr. Majila. And I think you'll see in as the statement unfolds that we did try to take action to confirm. As we spoke, I came to understand the term regularized to mean that SAHL needs to find a means of incorporating the payment of the amount of 95 million rand to MMI so that such payment is commercially acceptable to all stakeholders. I advised them that I could not think of any way of regularizing such payment, but I would have to speak to Mr. Penwarden about the matter. I responded in this manner because firstly, I was taken aback by the discussion. Secondly, I knew that what was being asked was improper. And thirdly, I wanted to have the opportunity to discuss this with the directors of SAHL that I was in Johannesburg with, namely Mr. Penwarden and Mr. Kelso. During the meeting, Mr. Masekesa said he was putting a call through to Dr. Majila in my presence. The reason for the call to Dr. Majila was to demonstrate to me that Dr. Majila was in favor of MMI being paid 95 million rand if this payment could be regularized. Mr. Masekesa did indeed pick up his phone and make a call that was unanswered, but I have no way of knowing whether the number that he had called in my presence was Dr. Majila's number. Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa then said I should brief Mr. Penwarden on their discussion with me that afternoon to see how SAHL could regularize these payments to MMI. Two, that they are willing to hold a further meeting between Mr. Penwarden, Mr. Maponya, and Mr. Masekesa and I on the next day if further information or clarification was required by SAHL. Three, SAHL should develop a proposal to regularize these payments to MMI and that such proposal should be submitted to the two of them, namely Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa, and that Mr. Masekesa would then present that proposal to Dr. Majila. I refer to these matters that they wanted me to do as action items required from me and SAHL. That brought the meeting to an end and I went back to the Radisson Blue Gautrain Hotel. My meeting with Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa lasted approximately 1 hour. Mr. Penwarden, Mr. Kelso and I met as we had arranged at 6 p.m. and traveled in one Uber vehicle to the Signature Restaurant in Morningside Mall in Sandton. I relayed the entire discussion that Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa had with me at Nelson Mandela Square to Mr. Penwarden and Mr. Kelso. They were both extremely concerned. We discussed the matter at length over dinner, that it did not feel right and that it was confusing, particularly in the light of the discussion that Mr. Penwarden had with Dr. Majila in July 2018, where Dr. Majila had made it clear that the issue of 45 million rand was closed, as MMI was not entitled to payment of any fees in respect of the 9 billion rand facility. And that was especially confusing because MMI was neither mandated nor contracted to perform any services in relation to the further facility of 10 billion rand that SAHL was in the process of securing from the GEPF. I recall specifically saying that SAHL cannot do anything illegal, and if that stance results in SAHL losing out on the further facility that it had applied for, then so be it. We agreed at the dinner that evening that we need to handle this matter carefully, as SAHL did not want the matter to result in a fight and in a manner similar to the difficult relations between Mr. Penwarden and Mr. Maponya during 2016 over SAHL's position in relation to the claim for the fees of 45 million rand. We also agreed at dinner that the next day Mr. Penwarden would speak to Mr. Masekesa to clarify what they meant in their discussion with me, as it made no sense in light of the meeting that he had in July with both Dr. Majila and Mr. Masekesa.
I hope that fight was not physical.
No, it was not physical, Commissioner. Probably just as bruising, though. On 6 September 2018, during one of the breaks, during the Development Fund Strategy Workshop, Mr. Penwarden had a discussion with Mr. Masekesa. He relayed to myself and Mr. Kelso that Mr. Masekesa had confirmed the discussion that I said they had with me that previous afternoon. Mr. Penwarden informed us that he asked Mr. Masekesa to set up a meeting with Dr. Majila so that he could clarify why the issue of 45 million rand had been reopened when Dr. Majila had made it clear that the issue was closed. Mr. Masekesa said that Mr. Penwarden should not look to meet with Dr. Majila. Rather, he should prepare the proposal and submit it to him, and that he, Mr. Masekesa, would put it before Dr. Majila. On or about 12 September 2018, Mr. Penwarden asked me to send him an email setting out what happened during the discussion I had over drinks with Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa on 5 September of 2018. On 13 September 2018, I was in Johannesburg, and 14 September 2018, I prepared a draft summary of what was said, which I finalized on 17 September 2018, that being a Monday, and emailed to Mr. Penwarden. Thereafter, I decided it made sense to make notes of all telephone calls I had with Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa, and to email Mr. Penwarden and inform him of what was said during such telephone calls. The document that I have attached, marked ZZD1, is a collation of all the emails that I sent to Mr. Penwarden informing him of my discussions, first on 5 September 2018, and thereafter on the dates that are reflected at the top of each summary. To be clear, ZZD1 is a collation of the emails that I sent to Mr. Penwarden freely and voluntarily to keep him updated on discussions I was having with Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa. During December 2018, Mr. Penwarden requested that I should sign this collation of emails so that it reads as a statement, and I duly signed same on 14 December 2018. On 20 September 2018, I had a further discussion with Mr. Penwarden where we resolved that I need to inform Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa that what they had asked us to investigate cannot be done. I subsequently had a telephonic discussion with Mr. Maponya on 20 September 2018 and informed him that we had given the matter due consideration and that we had not found a commercially acceptable way for SAHL to accommodate the payment of the transaction origination fees to MMI that would pass the scrutiny of our board, shareholders, auditors, and other external stakeholders. During that conversation, he said that resolving the transaction origination fee issue would mean that SAHL avoids litigation as he was preparing to go to court on this issue. Mr. Maponya then suggested that SAHL obtain an opinion from counsel, the same that had given an opinion in 2016, to inform that counsel that there had been a cession that was granted by the PIC to MMI, and that this cession had later been withdrawn, and that he, counsel, needs to provide an updated opinion. The sense I got from this comment is that Mr. Maponya held the view that the issue by the PIC of a cession and later withdrawing it demonstrated that insofar as the PIC was concerned, it accepted that this was money owing to MMI. I undertook to discuss the request for an opinion with Mr. Penwarden. I wish to deal briefly with the legal opinion obtained in 2016 that he was referring to. On or about 29 April 2016, Dr. Majila signed a cession in accordance with the PIC, in accordance with which the PIC ceded its rights to the amount of 45 million rand that was due to it as an arranging and underwriting fee to MMI. SAHL was concerned about the cession that Dr. Majila had signed and had obtained an opinion from counsel to advise it on whether it should pay the arranging and underwriting fee purportedly ceded by the PIC to MMI. I have not seen this opinion, but I understand that it concluded that payment under the cession could not take place. On 26 September 2018, I had a telephonic discussion with Mr. Maponya, during which he wanted to find out how far we had progressed with the legal opinion. I informed him that I had communicated what he said to me with Mr. Penwarden and our company secretary, and that I understood that a legal opinion would take approximately 3 weeks. Mr. Maponya said obtaining the legal opinion was urgent and that the instructions to council should mention that an advisory fee had already been paid to MMI in the amount of 7.5 million rand, and that the PIC had signed a cession in favor of MMI in respect of the arranging and underwriting fee. I explained that the advisory fee that had been paid had been for a different product, namely the development finance business. Mr. Maponya informed me that he expected the legal opinion to show that the matter of the transaction origination fee was between MMI and the PIC. I informed Mr. Maponya that I intended to send him and Mr. Masekesa an email setting out what I told him telephonically, namely that SAHL had not found a commercially acceptable way to accommodate the payment of transaction origination fees to MMI. Mr. Maponya advised against sending an email as he thought it would be premature. I said I will call Mr. Masekesa and give him the same update that I'd given to Mr. Maponya. On 27 September 2018, I had a telephonic discussion with Mr. Masekesa to update him on the telephonic discussions I had with Mr. Maponya, and that Mr. Maponya wanted us to get an opinion as described above. Mr. Masekesa said that if a legal opinion is sought, it would mean reopening the issue, and this could not be done unless the SAHL board authorizes it. Mr. Masekesa suggested that the process should begin with the matter being presented for a board discussion, and during such discussion, SAHL to indicate whether any new information has come to light or any previously held view had changed. The board would then take a decision on whether to reopen the matter. And if the matter is reopened, the legal opinion could be sought. I said to Masekesa I would speak to Mr. Penwarden and obtain his view. I duly reported back to Mr. Penwarden, and from the time he took over the handling of this matter. November 2018. My next involvement was my presence at the SAHL board meeting on 7 November 2018. Whilst I am not a member of the SAHL board, I regularly sit in attendance at board meetings. During the meeting, Mr. Penwarden made mention to the board of a letter he had received from MMI during October 2018, in which MMI requested SAHL's support and motivation for the payment of the transaction origination fees. The board resolved that it did not wish to reopen the matter as there was no new information presented, and the SAHL position remained that no further fees were to be paid to MMI. Mr. Masekesa was present at that board meeting, and he too was in support of the board's position that I have described. Mr. Maponya was also present at that board meeting, however, he had recused himself from the discussion. After the board meeting of 7 November 2018, I have had no further discussions with Mr. Maponya and Mr. Masekesa on the matter.
Mr. Dlamini, I'd like to refer back to your annexure ZZD1. On second page, there's a statement, there's a page with the title, A Statement in Contemplation of the Prospect of Litigation. And I suppose this was an annexure to Mr. Penwarden's statement. Can you just kindly clarify the dates?
Commissioner, that statement, the dates, you will see that the first date that appears is 17 September. That date, 17 September, is actually the date of the email that I sent, 17 September, not the date of the meeting. So the meeting was actually 5 September 2018. Hence, I have included the email of 17 September and the statement as part of the same annexure to clarify that issue of the dates. The 20 September heading relates to a discussion that took place on 20 September. 26 September also refers to a discussion that took place on 26 September. 27 September also refers to a discussion that took place on 27 September. And as I had indicated, 5 September was a face-to-face meeting. 20, 26, and 27 September were telephonic discussions.
Can I ask you a couple of questions in relation to the annexure? If you looked on the first page on 26th of September, the last bullet point, this question of whether you would like me to brief Roy on the matter. I'm assuming that refers to Roy Raja.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Can you tell us about any interaction you had with Mr. Raja in relation to this matter?
Commissioner, I have had no interaction at all with Mr. Raja. What happened after that, if I may just give some, after that discussion with Mr. Maponya, I spoke to Mr. Masekesa, and it was very clear that Mr. Masekesa's position was, before a legal opinion can be obtained, it must go back to the board. So at that point, it wasn't, and I realized that it's not an issue I should be asking him to talk to Mr. Raja about. So I didn't even offer that as a request to Mr. Masagesa. I just went and reported back to Mr. Penwarden after that discussion.
On the following page, that's page 2, the last paragraph, you had a brief discussion on Bayport, and they being Mr. Masikesa and Mr. Maponya, I'm assuming when you say they.
That is correct, Commissioner.
Could you tell us a little bit about Bayport and what the reference was that that SA Home Loans should not be concerned because they're not ready? What was the context to that discussion?
Commissioner, during 2018, as our funding application was, still in the process of being considered, we learned, I don't know exactly when about in 2018, I would estimate around the second to third quarter of 2018. We learned that Bayport Financial Services, another financial institution, was also preparing to enter the government employee home loans market, and that they were in discussions with the PIC to also offer them funding support, and that they had also approached the GHS to signal their intentions to offer services to government employees or products to government employees. So the context to that bullet point, Commissioner, is it was one of the items I had reported on during the strategy workshop, and they were then giving me their insights that Bayport was actually not ready to enter the government employee home loans market. I contributed to that discussion by just adding the internal position that we were concerned about, the reputation that Bayport has, not in home loans because they're not active in that market, but in unsecured lending, and also we were concerned that they don't have home loans experience. The position of SA Home Loans as a service provider to the GHS has been that we understand there will be other institutions that offer products to government employees. So we certainly did not believe that there's exclusivity to SA Home Loans. And Bayport approaching the PIC or the GHS, they were well within their rights to do so. In my role, I had to obviously appraise the board on developments in this market, and so that we as a business can also respond, I guess, competitively.
But there was no connection of Mr. Masikesa or Mr. Maponya with Bayport?
No, there was not.
It was just a discussion about what they knew?
Correct, Commissioner.
Ms. Kuwe, just before you tell us you're done, what do we do with the contents of paragraphs 19, 20, and there's a third one where the witness says, it was relayed to me, which would amount to hearsay. What weight do we give? If somebody were to come, if somebody were to come and say that's not what's contained in those paragraphs is not true, what weight would we give to the contents of those paragraphs?
Commissioner, Mr. Penwarden has already testified regarding the discussions between Mr. Dlamini and himself. So basically, Mr. Dlamini was confirming what Mr. Penwarden has already testified.
That's the answer that I was expecting. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I wasn't trying to trick you.
Thank you, Commissioner. That concludes Mr. Dlamini's testimony. May he be excused.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Dlamini, thank you very much for your time and for putting the facts in support of Mr. Penwarden's testimony before us. Thank you very much, and you are excused.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner, that concludes the business for the day.
For half a day.
Half the day.
Yes, and I assume that we can adjourn until Tuesday. Am I correct?
You are correct, Commissioner.
Yes. The adjournment is because the next witness will be available only on Tuesday. Correct? You're nodding your head, Ms. Kuwe.
I cannot put myself on record saying that it is not within my knowledge.
All right. Fortunately, we were advised about the position. We will then adjourn until Tuesday. What date will be Tuesday? 2nd, isn't it? 28, 29, 30, 31. 2nd. Tuesday the 2nd. If that's not the correct date, it will be Tuesday next week.
Commissioner, I think June has 30 days.
Maybe I'm confusing you, but by not mentioning the month. It's the 2nd of July. Thank you.